At this moment, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce someone for some opening remarks, and it's Dr. Aaron Mayer. Dr. Mayer is an environmental justice pioneer who works across a broad variety of spaces, health, environment, and voting rights and disparities. Over the last 40 years, he's been a veteran of urban environmentalism, and he's been a regional and national environmental justice organizer. He was the 57th national president of the Sierra Club, and now he's currently working at the Adirondack Council's Wilderness Campaign Director for Clean Water, Jobs, and Wilderness. And I'm also proud to say that he's been a long time champion for the Hudson River Superfund cleanup. In fact, going all the way back to the 1990s, Dr. Mayer was one of the founders of the Friends of the Clean Hudson, who is bringing you this presentation this evening. Dr. Mayer?
Thank you, and it is indeed an honor to be here. And for me, this is not only a area that is that I'm extremely sensitive to, but also it's a critical part of my life. When I came of age and able to fish with my dad and all of his vets and friends in the Hudson River Valley, in Peekskill and Beacon, and the waterways from 1965 to 1978, you know, we were oblivious to the Clean Water Act. We were oblivious to the PCBs. And I came from a large family of 9, and the Hudson River was a huge protein source for our family. We would pack during the shad runs, the heron runs, and the striped bass run, 50-gallon drums for fish and salt pack them. This was a critical point of subsistence for my community and communities like mine. This is, as I say, predating government food subsidy programs for the poor. The Hudson River was a vital source for nutrition for our family. It was then, and even after the Clean Water Act, as I became aware of the contaminants within the Hudson, it still is. Even though there's been the Hudson River advisories that we have been major advocates for, and I was an activist and participated in posting these signs, but also let me also flag the fact I forgot to mention at the beginning, I just retired for 36 years in the New York State Department of Health and the Bureau of Chronic Disease Evaluation and Research as an epidemiological spatial analyst, or basically disease and outbreak mapper. But the long and short of it is that going from depending upon the Hudson, learning the crisis and the science of the Hudson has been a critical part of my background. I was part of the effort back in 1998 when Carol Browner came to testify for Richard Brodsky at the New York State Assembly. And they were talking about TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, of what the General Electric was allowed to permit to pollute lawfully and what's the maximum that could be. That was the science then, not the harm to human beings or human being dependency. I was allowed to testify at that hearing and to remind them that it is the people, stupid. It is the risk associated with exposure, the risk associated with consumption, and that people by the thousands of New Yorkers in the Hudson River Valley going from the harbor all the way up through Fort Edward, people were recreationally fishing or subsistence fishing. In fact, there were fishermen industries that were destroyed by this contamination. Then they were arguing about the best science, and ours was arguing about the risk. At the end of the day, that hearing basically tipped it in the odds in the favor for all New Yorkers and the movement that I was part of, and recognizing that people were at risk and the PCBs pose an existential threat and a long-term threat to human beings as well as flora and fauna within the Hudson River Valley. We've been very proud of that. And more importantly, when we formed the Friends of Clean Hudson in the environmental justice community of Arbor Hill in the late 1990s, it was an honor whereby all environmental groups and frontline communities at risk in that threat came together to argue and advocate for the people. And here we are to this day, standing up for the science, but more importantly, for the people. Right now, when they began, they argued about the science and that we must follow the science and that the decisions must be based upon the science. But now here we are, 15 years, the third 5-year study, they're now moving from the science to avoidance. Avoidance is not the way we solve the climate crisis. Avoidance is not the way we deal with natural disasters. Avoidance is not what we deal with any threat or risk to human health. What we need is basically to push them to push for the solutions for an action and or, as I say, activities that would go forward to remove the PCBs that remain in the Hudson. It is indeed an honor to be here with this body. And when we founded Clean Hudson, Friends of Clean Hudson, I want to say we produced a lot of leaders. In fact, two of my daughters who were youth leaders and organizers within the Friends of Clean Hudson, when they organized youth activists, who went on from their leadership to become officers commissioned at West Point, the United States Military Academy, are a symbol of the leadership that has been built upon educating our youth and frontline communities on the science, but also to become activists and leaders to try and protect people, as I say, from the adverse risk and threats that are posed by eating contaminated fish. But more importantly now than more than ever, we need the EPA to follow through on the science, to continue the science and move us to a point of solutions and remedies that will hold General Electric's feet to the fire, but more importantly, this administration's feet to the fire with regards to protecting human health and the environment. And I want to thank you, Althea and my colleagues here for giving me this opportunity. And I would like to introduce Peter Lopez. If Peter is on, and he's the Executive Director of Policy and Advocacy at Scenic Hudson.
Thank you, Aaron. And it's an honor to be here as well. And we're thankful for all the folks who are in attendance to hear more about our findings. Very thankful for the team that we have working, very thoughtful and knowledgeable team. My goal in the next minute or two is just to help provide some context and really set the table for hearing the insights and observations from our colleagues as part of today's presentation. So just by way of background, I know that all of us feel this way about the Hudson. It's an American heritage river. It's an estuary of national significance. It's a place of beauty and inspiration right in our backyard. Unfortunately, nearly 200 miles of the Hudson River has been designated as a PCB Superfund site. And what that means, that's a designation that's reserved for the worst and most toxic areas in the nation. Despite removal action by GE, some removal action, this stretch of the river remains one of the largest and oldest contaminated sites in the nation, comparable to Deepwater Horizon in geographic and economic scope and environmental damage. This is a blight on the future recovery and a legacy danger to human health and the environment, to our people, our habitats, our wildlife. The new data analysis you will see today shows that PCB levels are not declining at the rate expected to meet the goals of the cleanup plan that EPA had advanced initially. The data is clear, and we're calling on EPA to acknowledge that the remedy is not working, so steps can be taken to get the cleanup back on track. Why does this matter? People are getting hurt. People continue to eat fish from the Hudson, despite the health warnings. Habitat and wildlife continue to be harmed by PCBs. Women, children, communities of color, immigrants, economically disadvantaged communities are at highest risk. And many subsist on the contaminated fish, as you heard from our colleague, Aaron. So this is a matter that needs to be addressed now. We can't wait for another generation to clean up the Hudson. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my capable colleague, Drew Gambles, who is the staff attorney for Riverkeeper. She's part of Team Riverkeeper. She's a thoughtful, dedicated, knowledgeable partner and very active working with us in defending the valley. So Drew, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Pete. I really appreciate that. I just want to make sure that my camera's on, audio's on. Awesome. So just to get us started, I wanted to give everyone a quick background about the Hudson River PCB Superfund site. For 30 years, from 1947 to 1977, General Electric dumped PCBs into the Hudson River from two manufacturing plants located in the towns of Fort Edward and Hudson Falls, New York. In 1984, EPA finally designated a 200-mile stretch of the Hudson River from Fort Edward to New York Harbor as a Superfund site because of the hazards of PCBs. This 200-mile Superfund site is the largest Superfund site in the United States. It includes 14 New York counties and 2 New Jersey counties. Now, during a cleanup, a site can be divided into a number of distinct areas that are broken down depending on the complexity of the problems. And these areas are referred to as operable units. They address either different geographic areas, specific site problems, or areas where a specific action might be required. The Hudson River is divided into 5 operable units. Today, we're focusing on operable unit number 2. That refers to the 2002 record of decision dredging in the upper Hudson River. In addition to these 5 operable units, the Hudson River Superfund site is divided into the upper Hudson River, as I mentioned. That is the 40-mile stretch from Fort Edward to Federal Dam at Troy. And the lower Hudson River is a 160-mile stretch from the Federal Dam at Troy to New York Harbor. In addition to that, just to make it more complicated, the upper Hudson River is then divided into 3 different river sections. So the maps you have displayed on these slides shows you the 4 operable units. Operable unit number 5 is the lower Hudson River. It's not actually shown on this graph. And the other map shows the different river sections. So this just helps you put in place kind of where we are in the Superfund site and how large it is. In 2002, EPA adopted a record of decision which selected the dredging as the remedy to remove PCB contaminated sediments in that upper Hudson River. Again, that 40-mile stretch. This remedy was selected because it was meant to yield rapid results compared to just natural recovery. Now, the dredging that was selected in 2002 was conducted in 2 phases between 2009 and 2015, with 2015 being the last year of dredging. The ROD also included, and I say ROD, I just want to be clear, that's the record of decision. And a lot of us will just use these acronyms. If at any time an acronym is confusing or you don't understand what it means, just throw a message in the chat so we can clarify. We're so used to using these acronyms, we sometimes don't realize. So the record of decision in 2002 also included institutional controls in the form of fish consumption advisories and fishing restrictions. And so these controls were designed to prevent or limit exposure to PCBs by limiting consumption of contaminated fish. The ROD included 5 remedial action goals. These were the goals that the dredging was meant to achieve. The most important to us to discuss today is the goal EPA set to reduce the cancer risks and non-cancer health hazards for people eating fish from the Hudson River by reducing the concentration of PCBs in that fish. As part of that goal, EPA adopted 2 preliminary remediation goals. This is a 0.4 milligrams per kilogram of PCBs in fish fillet, which was meant to be achieved within 5 years of completion of dredging. Now remember, I said dredging finished in 2015, which means that this goal should have been achieved in 2020. This goal is important because it means that the fish can be eaten by an average angler about 1/2 pound meal every 2 months. The next interim goal that EPA set in the record of decision was 0.2 milligrams per kilograms PCBs in fish fillet. EPA said that they were going to achieve this goal within 16 years of completion of dredging. So that means we're supposed to be achieving this goal by 2031. This goal means that an average angler can eat or consume fish at a rate of 1/2 pound meal per month. Attaining these levels is supposed to facilitate the relaxation of fish consumption advisories and fishing restrictions, which is why they're so critical to the EPA. Next slide, please. So under the federal Superfund law, EPA is required to conduct a study every 5 years of hazardous waste cleanups. These cleanups are required when the remedy did not completely remove all contaminants from the site. So in the case of the Hudson River, while EPA and GE might say that tons of PCBs were removed, there's actually a lot of PCBs that remain behind in the Hudson River. Now, the purpose of a 5-year review is to determine whether the remedy is achieving the agency's goals for the cleanup, specifically whether the cleanup is protective of human health and the environment. Now, these reviews begin right at the start of construction. Now, 5-year reviews are done to determine whether the remedy, again, is achieving the goals for the cleanup, those 5 goals that I had mentioned earlier. And the process is supposed to be grounded in science and the law. And at its core, it's about the lives and livelihoods of people living along the river. This is especially true for marginalized communities, which may rely on contaminated Hudson River fish for food. And a key purpose of the process allows and encourages EPA to address potential problems with the remedy as they become apparent. Next slide. So in this third 5-year review, EPA is going to evaluate new data collected since the second 5-year review was conducted in 2017. This 5-year review will be one of many future reviews. Again, they're conducted every 5 years, and they're going to be conducted until the Superfund site is clean and safe, which will probably be a long time for the Hudson River. Now, these reviews, as I mentioned on the prior slide, they begin at the start of construction. So the first 5-year review for the Hudson River was conducted in 2012. EPA at that time concluded that the remedy will be protective. Again, it's important to keep in mind that at that time, dredging was still occurring. So the conclusion that the dredging remedy will be protective seemed reasonable. In the second 5-year review, which was issued in 2017 and finalized in 2019, EPA deferred a determination about the protectiveness of the cleanup remedy in the upper Hudson River until additional Hudson River fish tissue data could be gathered. As described in the second 5-year review, EPA stated that it anticipated that additional years of data may be needed to determine the rate of fish recovery with statistical confidence. For the third 5-year review, EPA must acknowledge the failure of the upper Hudson River remedy to meet the goals and objectives expected in the timeframe set forth in the record of decision. We now have 5 more years of data that clearly show that fish PCB concentrations have not reduced as anticipated. The first record of decision target was not met. I mean, it's now 2023, and we have not come close to that 0.4 goal. And sediment concentrations are not declining as they were modeled in the 2002 record of decision. Our goal now is to persuade EPA to issue a not protective determination based on the law and the science. Then we can figure out how we can make the remedy work. Only a not protective determination opens the door to allow that change. And so for these reasons, EPA must acknowledge that the remedy is not protective. So just some key points for this third 5-year review that I want to point out. So EPA appears to be abandoning the recovery timeline set forth in the record of decision, this 0.4 and the 0.2 goals. The timeline was the whole reason that EPA selected the dredging remedy. Now, EPA needs to meet its commitment and find a solution to get back on that schedule. You know, EPA seems to be demonstrating that these timelines don't matter, and we need to continue to push because they do matter. Next slide. So just some key points from the current data. EPA is relying on fish consumption advisories to limit the risks of PCBs. The consumption of contaminated fish is the single greatest source of human exposure of PCBs, which is why fish consumption advisories, unfortunately, are so necessary. EPA is in effect turning the cleanup action into a risk avoidance remedy, which really can't go unchallenged. This risk avoidance strategy forces the public to alter their own behaviors to avoid harms from exposure to PCB contamination. The burden's on the risk bearer to protect themselves. So in this case, the fish consumer, rather than the polluters to clean up and eliminate the risk. The data trends tell a very clear story. Post-dredging natural recovery is just not working as EPA anticipated. Recent sampling shows that PCB concentrations in sediment and fish are much higher than EPA modeled and are not declining at rates necessary to achieve EPA's goals. Without reducing the concentration of PCBs in fish to the target levels, EPA is going to have to continue to rely on fish consumption advisories. And EPA's reliance on these fish consumption advisories is necessary to avoid the risks and is not an effective nor a just control of the potential human health impacts from ingesting PCBs. And fish consumption advisories do nothing to actually help the fish. They can't read the signs. So I just want to quickly dive into what are these fish consumption advisories? What do they say? So you can hit the next slide. Yeah, perfect. There are 3 considerations that inform how the Department of Health develops their fish consumption advisories. Who is eating the fish? What kind of fish is being eaten? And where are they catching the fish? So the next slide shows a chart. You can hit the, there we go. The next slide shows a chart from the Department of Health's website that shows fish consumption advisories for the Hudson River. The sensitive population refers to people who may be childbearing age, which is 50 and under, and children under 15. And then the general population refers to everyone else. The sensitive population cannot eat any fish from the Hudson River for the entire 200-mile stretch of the Superfund site. No fish. And then depending on where you are, the general population has other restrictions. And sometimes it's based on what, again, like I said before, what type of fish it is and where it's being caught. So it's important to check the Department of Health's website, DEC's website for updated regulations and special restrictions for certain species. In addition to that, there's also special instructions on how to cut the fish to minimize PCB intake. Not many people check DEC's website or DOH's website to be aware of what these restrictions are. And so it's important to make sure that this information is out there and known to the public that these restrictions exist. Next slide. The maps on these slides highlight public access fishing waters and provide anglers and fish consumers with a visual guide to the different types of consumption advice. And there may be other waters in your county with public access that are actually not highlighted in these maps. EPA established the preliminary remediation goals that I have highlighted throughout my portion of the presentation, the 0.4 and the 0.2, because these targets meant that New York could change or eliminate its fish consumption advisories. As we discussed, EPA is not moving towards these targets, and as a result, these advisories have remained the same and continue to remain and will continue to remain the same for decades. So I'd like to now pass the mic to Kevin Farrar to discuss the data and the conclusions. Kevin Farrar is a retired engineering geologist from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. He has dedicated his life to the Hudson River and has a wealth of knowledge about the Hudson River PCB Superfund site. He is also one of the authors of the Friends of Clean Hudson report, which analyzes the EPA's Upper Hudson River dredging remedy. His work as one of our independent consultants has helped shape our understanding of the data and the conclusions set forth in the report. His work has just been so helpful to us to grasp what is happening with the Superfund site. Kevin is an expert in remedial actions. He's an expert in PCB transport and just an overall expert about the Hudson River. So without further ado, I will let Kevin walk us through the data. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Drew. Just to start out, I'll go over a little bit about 5-year reviews. It's important to point out that this 5-year review is only for the 40 miles of the Upper Hudson from Fort Edward to Troy. Although the Superfund site goes all the way down to New York Harbor, EPA only selected remedy for the upper 40 miles. So this review is only focused on the data and the performance of the remedy that was implemented in those 40 miles. So when EPA does a 5-year review, the focus of the report is to answer 3 fundamental questions to help determine if the remedy is protective or not. The first question, is the remedy functioning as intended by the decision documents? In plain language, is it working the way we thought? We think the answer is probably no. In question B, are the exposure assumptions, all the other assumptions that EPA used when they selected remedy over 20 years ago, are they still valid? We suspect that some of the assumptions that were used at the time may need to be updated. Question C, the third question, has any other information come to light that could call into question the protectiveness of the remedy? Have we learned anything since the ROD was issued, the record decision was issued in the early 2000s? Yes, there's been a vast amount of environmental data which has been gathered since the ROD was issued that can help inform us and let us know about whether or not the remedy is protective. Next slide. So I'm going to show you a couple different sets of data. The first one we're going to talk about is sediment, and then we'll talk a little bit about fish. It looks to us like the sediment PCB concentrations are not declining after dredging the way that was anticipated by EPA when they selected a remedy. If you look at the graph on the left, it's a graph of total sediment PCB concentrations. The yellow bars is where we should have been if we started out at the end of dredging and then looked at how much it's changed over time. EPA anticipated that to be about an 8% a year decline in sediment concentrations after dredging. That does not appear to be happening. If you look at the yellow bar, it's what would be anticipated with that decline. And the red bars are what was actually quantified in 2021. And you see river section 1, 2, 3. River section 1 is the first 6 miles of river downstream of Fort Edward. That's where the highest levels of contamination were, and it's also where the most intense removals, the most dredging was done. But the data seem to show, they do show, that the PCB concentrations in the surface sediments, just the top 2 inches. That's what EPA chose as their metric to quantify the changes in sediment concentration over time. It looks like the concentration in the top 2 inches in river section 1 have actually gone up a bit, which is a bit perplexing, confounding. We also see that, well, certainly this graph shows that it's higher. We'll see on the next slide that it's actually gone up a little bit. Can you go back? I need a little bit more to go on this one. So if you look at river section 2 and 3, in each case, when you do the comparison, what would be anticipated at the anticipated rate of decline and what was measured, what's measured is higher. And that's both in terms in the left graph of total PCBs, and on the right, it's in terms of tri-plus PCBs. Tri-plus PCBs are simply that portion of the PCB mixture. PCB is a mixture of 209 different chemicals. So if you have those PCBs which have 3 or more chlorines, they're a little more persistent in the environment. They're more highly bioaccumulative. They'll absorb, accumulate in biota and in people, really, more than the lighter ones. So what we see is, looking at it from a tri-plus point of view, we see about the same trend that we see in total, that the concentrations that were measured are higher than you would anticipate given the assumed 8% reduction per year since the dredging ended. Now you can go to the next slide. So this one just shows the 2 sets of data. There was a little bit of data gathered by GE in 2016, and then a more robust data set in 2017 by the state. So that's our first one after dredging. And then EPA had GE go out and do a fairly robust sampling in 2021 also. So what we should see, if there's a active, ongoing, robust natural recovery, we should see that the 2021 data is lower than the data gathered in 2016 and 17. In river section 1, we don't see that. In river section 2, that's the 6 miles from Thompson Island Dam, which is a little ways down from Fort Edward, down to Schuylerville. It's only gone down by a relatively modest amount. Same thing in river section 3 from Schuylerville down to Troy, where we should have seen a fairly robust recovery in that top 2 inches of surface sediment. But instead, in river section 1, we don't see any recovery at all. And in river section 2 and 3, only a very modest recovery. If you look at it in terms of tri-plus, you pretty much see the same thing, where in river section 1, that the concentrations appear to actually have gone up a wee bit, and the in river sections 2 and 3, between the upper part and all the way down to Troy, we see only very modest recovery in surface sediment. Next slide, please. So if the sediment is not recovering as anticipated, what's going on with the fish now? So EPA created a metric. They created a weighted average total PCB concentration that they calculate from all the fish, 14 different locations, 3 different species, throughout the 40 miles of the upper Hudson. That's the metric they chose to monitor. So the 2016 data, first year after dredging, these fish were collected in the spring, typically late May, early June. So these fish are what were exposed to the last year of dredging. So from 2016 to 17, the dredging's been over for a year now, and we do see that there was a reduction from 2016 to 17. After that, the rate of decline appears to have slowed significantly in average fish in terms of total PCB in the upper Hudson. Next slide. So this graph, the green dots is the exact same data as you saw in the previous graph. But here we put it on the same graph with what the two targets were that were established in the rod for fish flesh concentrations. 0.4 part per million was the target to be reached 5 years after dredging. That was supposed to be 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and that target was not reached. The lower target, 0.2, is the target that's to be met in 16 years after dredging, or in 2031. And with the current very modest decline in fish PCB concentrations, it does not appear likely that that target will be met. So to put this in context, is the remedy performing as anticipated? It appears that that answer is probably no. And with that, I will turn it back over and go on to the next speaker, Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm just going to do a brief introduction for Dr. Carpenter, our next speaker. Dr. Carpenter is a professor at the University of Albany and director for the Institute of Health and the Environment. He is also a public health physician who received his MD from Harvard Medical School. Dr. Carpenter is a leading expert on the impact of PCBs on human health. One area of Dr. Carpenter's research, with implications for people living near the Hudson, has examined rates of disease among people who live near hazardous waste sites with toxic PCBs. Dr. Carpenter's research found elevated rates of hospitalization for diabetes and high blood pressure in areas on either side of the Hudson, despite healthier lifestyles in these populations. I am so pleased to turn the mic over to Dr. Carpenter to discuss his research with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Drew. Yes, you basically gave us the punchline from the studies we did looking at hospitalization for diseases along PCB-containing hazardous waste sites in New York State. The interesting thing about the Hudson is that all 200 miles of the Hudson, people that live close to the river, which is a beautiful hazardous waste site, tend to have higher incomes. They tend to smoke less, exercise more, and live a healthier lifestyle. In spite of all of that, we found that the rates of hospitalization for heart disease, for high blood pressure, for diabetes were elevated. Now, of course, that by itself, those are called ecologic studies, and they don't prove anything because there are lots of reasons for bias. So what we've done since then, I've long worked with the Mohawk population at Akwesasne in northern New York State, where the exposure comes from the St. Lawrence River, which is almost the same story as the Hudson River. And this looks at metabolic diseases there, as also at Anniston, Alabama, which is the city that has one of the Monsanto plants that made PCBs. And most of these people never worked for Monsanto, they just lived nearby and they were exposed. What you see is obesity, heart disease, CVD is coronary vascular disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes. They're elevated in these people that have elevated PCB exposure. Well, going back and thinking about our ecologic studies, and also this data, this is just population evidence, it doesn't really prove anything. So we did 2 studies focusing on diabetes and high blood pressure. We looked in the Mohawks where we had medical records. We had blood PCBs measurements. We had physicians' diagnosis of diabetes, and we had all of the information. And what we did, shown in this slide, is we proved that the high PCB levels were what's correlated with the elevated risk of diabetes. And you see by quartiles of PCB levels, those people who were older and who had high levels of PCBs had strikingly more incidence of diabetes than did those people that had lower levels of PCBs. Now, I'm not going to show a slide, but we did the same kind of thing looking at high blood pressure. in the population in Anniston, Alabama. It's a population where the people living near the plant most of them were poor, about half black, half white. We did the same thing. We measured their blood pressure. We measured their serum PCB levels. And we found that the serum PCB levels were a stronger risk factor for high blood pressure than was race, was serum lipids, even was smoking. So I think that these results in general add to the conclusion that PCBs cause metabolic disease. They cause a variety of other diseases also that I don't have time to talk about. But exposure to PCBs is very dangerous. The major route of exposure is eating contaminated fish. And as you've already heard, the fish in the Hudson River are unsafe to eat. That's true also for the fish in the St. Lawrence River. And we've got to find ways of reducing exposure, especially since fish consumption is so important for indigenous communities, for poor communities, for people that really need to have nutrition coming from the rivers. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carpenter. Our last presenter tonight is Althea Malarkey. I know that everyone has heard from her. She has already spoken, but no one has properly introduced her. So I have the pleasure of introducing Althea, who is the PCB's project consultant for Scenic Hudson. Prior to her consultant role, Althea was the Assistant Director of Advocacy and Special Project Analyst with Scenic Hudson for over 15 years. Althea's institutional knowledge of the Hudson River PCB Superfund site is beyond impressive and incomparable. I just want to thank you for your decades of work on this topic and for sharing your knowledge with us today. Thanks, Althea.
Well, thank you so much, Drew. And as Aaron Mayer so eloquently put it before, this is a sort of a group effort. It takes a whole community, a whole region, a whole state, all of us working together to make something good happen out of something that's really terrible, the pollution of the Hudson River from GE's plants in the Upper Hudson. One thing that I really want to emphasize, and it's the key to this report as well, and to all of the reports that have been done on this to date. These 5-year reviews and our own expert report that we've released today, it's not about what was removed from the river that matters. Everyone acknowledges that there was a significant amount that was removed, and GE, under the auspices of EPA, did exactly what EPA asked them to do. They removed a significant portion from the 40 miles in the Upper Hudson. But that's not what this is about. It is what remains behind that is the point of all of this analysis. Are we going to get to the goals that the public expected, that EPA laid out in the record of decision? And we think, no, we've already missed one of the goals, and we are pretty much on track to miss the second goal. There is a significant mass of bioavailable PCBs that remain in the Upper Hudson River. And because of the amount that's still there, that is slowing the natural recovery that EPA is counting on to reach the goals. And I just want to be very clear, and we can maybe talk about that a little bit more when we talk about natural recovery. That doesn't mean that PCBs go away. That means they go someplace else. They can go into the air, they go in the water, and they come down to the lower Hudson River and become our problem. They go into the fish and they go into the animals. For the purposes of this review as well, we want to emphasize that we all were on board, and it's part of EPA's key mission is do risk reduction. Remove enough contamination to reduce the risk to people and the environment. That is a key Superfund strategy, and it's exactly what EPA is tasked to do. Look to the risk producers, in this case, General Electric, the polluter. They have to contain or eliminate their contamination in order to avoid health and ecological risks. We know in the Upper Hudson, it's the local sediments they dumped into the Upper Hudson that's the source of the problem. And obviously, coming down to the lower Hudson, our local sediments are now a problem as well. We also feel very strongly that EPA is on the right track. The burden needs to be on GE to address the sediments which are causing the risk. Next slide. Instead, what we're seeing, unfortunately, is if the risk reduction didn't work and the monitored natural recovery is not recovering at the rates that's expected, how are you going to get to protection of human health and the environment? And in this case, in the case of the Hudson, we're turning to risk avoidance. Other words, fish consumption advisories. The burden is placed on the risk bearers, in this case, the fish consumers, communities of color, communities from different culture who rely on the Hudson River for subsistence fishing, and economically disadvantaged communities as well. So the burden is being placed on the people to protect themselves rather than the Superfund purpose, which is to reduce the risk to people themselves. And as I think that Drew is actually the one that mentioned that before, risk avoidance does not address ecological risks. If you see this nice little sign on there, not one bird or animal fish that I know of can read these consumption advisory warnings. Next slide. The conclusions that we wanted to bring to you today from the independent analysis that we've seen is that the upper Hudson sediment PCB remedy is not protective of human health and the environment. And that's actually okay. That is the purpose of a 5-year review, is to identify any issues with a remedy and give us time to fix it and pivot and get on the path to a real restoration. We know that the human health and ecological risks are still well in excess of the accessible risk ranges. And we also know that without active interference in the system, for example, dredging, where we saw that nice step function that Kevin mentioned earlier, without some kind of active interference in the system, fish in the sediment PCB levels are not going to be in the acceptable range for the foreseeable future. And we'd like the public and we'd like you to challenge EPA on that, to live up to what they said they were going to do in the record of decision. Next slide. So there's lots of opportunities for engagement on this issue. Being here tonight is a big part of that. The Friends of the Clean Hudson Coalition has been doing this for since the 1990s. I don't know if Aaron Mayer is still on here, but I think it started at Arbor Hill, actually in Albany, where a group of people got together and said, it's not right, and we're not going to accept that PCBs are going to be poisoning people for the foreseeable future. We need to do something about it. And it was really a grassroots effort that got this cleanup started in the first place. And it's going to take grassroots effort to get EPA to acknowledge that we need to go onto a different path. At various times in the Superfund process, there are opportunities to comment. We know that EPA is going to be releasing its third 5-year review sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And because it is a public process, you're going to have an opportunity to comment on their third 5-year review, which we have not yet seen. But we want to be able to bring this information to you right now to sort of gear you up and get you ready for it. And if you're a member of the Friends of the Clean Hudson Coalition, which I think one of my colleagues is going to drop into the chat right now, if you're a member of the Friends of the Clean Hudson Coalition, we will flag those opportunities for you. I also want to flag the Community Advisory Group. This is a wonderful process that EPA has in place where they gather together stakeholders from the Hudson River, and you get to meet with EPA, who talks to you about the project. They talk to you about progress. They talk to you about challenges, and you have a voice at the table. I cannot emphasize how important it is to be a voice at the table. All the groups that you see before you tonight, we've been members of that Community Advisory Group for many, many years. We know that they're expanding the CAG right now. The acronym is CAG. Sorry for using an acronym. The Community Advisory Group is going to be expanding into the lower Hudson. And if you're interested in it, if you represent a municipality or a county or an organization that's interested in having your voice heard by EPA in this kind of venue, we welcome you and we'd be glad to send you more information. Next slide. So right now, the first action opportunity that we're really identifying for you is to contact Lisa Garcia. She is the EPA Region 2 Administrator, and she's the one that's really going to be signing off on the third 5-year review. She's new to the job, relatively new. We know that she just started a few years ago. We've met with her, we've talked with her, and we know that she understands where we're coming from. But we think she really needs to hear from the public as well. She needs to hear that EPA needs to follow the science and let science lead the way and make decisions best on the best available data. So you can also contact your state and federal elected officials who are also engaged in this. Tell them that you attended this event tonight and tell them that you have concerns. And so they know that they can hear from you as well. Next slide. And if you want to learn more or you have more questions that we don't get to tonight, you can see on this slide right here, any of the people on this slide, or even our organizations in general, we will welcome you to reach out to any of us. I would like to start the Q&A section of this. If anyone has any kind of questions that has not already been answered through the Q&A box, I encourage you to put that in there right now, and I will stop the recording so we can maybe have some open and candid discussion with all of you.